Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. This is actually the second time I'm trying to record this video, because the first time I just got carried away, quite frankly. It ended up being 40 something minutes, so we are gonna try and condense this one. So obviously we are in the middle of our champion rankings. We are doing our first class ranking because we ranked Mystic as the last out of the 6 classes at the moment in the game. We have done 2022 champion rankings, 2021 champion rankings, again, because I did feel that there is enough change in them with the 6 months passing. And then we ranked up all the MCOC classes. Now we need to go through each and every single one of them individually. And here we can see the old Mystic top 10 ranking from 6 months ago. So it started with Doom, went all the way down to Sorcerer Supreme as closing down the top 10. And we're going to see some fair amount of changes in between the rankings of these champions individually, but then on top of it there will be champions who are not making the top 10 anymore and some new additions to it. But let's just get to the main part. Now, there are a fair few disclaimers before we get any further. Obviously, the first one is that this is my own personal ranking. I don't try to present it as facts. I do try to keep it as objective as possible, trying to put aside my, personal preferences. For instance, I find Man-Thing to be one of the most fun champions in the game, but it is very important distinction in between fun and overall usefulness, popularity, and importance to the game. So obviously, Man-Thing is not going to be featured there. And on top of that, we're not including Magic and Scarlet Witch OG because they are not available as 6 stars. And that being said, if she was out as a 6 star, specifically speaking for Magic, she would be somewhere in the top 10. And the last point is the 2022 champions, because they are all very, very recent. I do not feel confident yet putting them up high as top 10 in the class. They definitely do have the potential to get in there, but we have to see exactly what they do in, different game modes as the content comes out and as more and more people acquire them. For instance, Rintra is quite obviously going to be a fairly popular Alliance War defender, but I do believe he will have plenty of offensive uses as well once people kind of get more used to the champion. Wong looks phenomenal when he can shine, but the problem is at the moment I'm struggling to find the places where exactly you would prefer to use Wong over majority of the other available options, and Wiccan isn't even really in the game yet. So for this ranking, I didn't include any of them in top 10 just because I do not feel knowledgeable enough, experienced enough with these champions to kind of rate them. And then the last one is specifically regarding spot number 10. I did have a very hard time putting up a champion in 10th spot because I do feel that about 6 champions would qualify thereabouts for that last spot. For instance, we have Dr. Voodoo, who still is a very great champion despite his senior status at the moment in the contest. And he definitely is aging well. He has plenty of uses, plenty of kind of niche unique bits to his skill kit as well. For instance, he's one of the very few Mystic champions that reduce opponents' ability accuracy by very potent 50-ish%. And then on top of it all, obviously he has very potent power control, buff control, which are kind of quintessential mechanics of a Mystic champion. And he's like the OG poison Mystic champion that also is becoming kind of more and more appealing, with more champions coming to the game whose regeneration rate cannot be altered in any way aside from poison. So poison as a debuff is becoming more important, and that's helping Dr. Voodoo as well. And then moving on, Dragon Man this time didn't quite make it to the contest, to the top 10 list. I still think he's a great champion. Absolutely love using him. Dual immune robot Mystic that has great access to Unstoppable, and that was also one of his biggest and best selling points, to be honest. And that's also one of the problems with the decrease in ranking, because we haven't had a particular need for Unstoppable within the last 6 months, and with the new content kind of moving on in slightly different directions, and we just don't see as much of that can't stop, won't stop node, for instance, being thrown around. And there are different alternative options for that as well. I still think he's a great champion. Obviously, he kind of proved himself, in my opinion, in Eternity of Pain by being able to do most of the fights in Eternity of the Pain. But in general use over the contest, Alliance War, Alliance Quest, so on and so forth, I know that there are people who still do use him, but I just don't feel that he's growing in popularity, and he's kind of like being the one that's to watch out for. That being said, still definitely a great rank up, and I fully understand why people like rank and use him in different game modes. Similar thing about Sasquatch. Sasquatch on me personally has been growing up even more and more. I did end up ranking him for Battlegrounds defense specifically. I was quite surprised that he was even quite capable offensively too. My biggest gripe with Sasquatch is still the fact that it is absolutely random when he enters that Wrath of Tenerak, and that makes it difficult to line up the fights, and that, you know, makes these fights much trickier than they should be. If he had some sort of specific mark you had to get to trigger Wrath of Tenerak, similar to, for instance, the Mole Man's Frenzy, because you can activate it when you want it, at a time when it matters most in a fight. And, you know, lining those special attacks properly and gaining that, for instance, stun immunity would be huge if you could control it, but at the moment it's just quite unreliable the way Sasquatch functions right now. That being said, definitely the champion, you know, I have been enjoying him more and more, and you can make an argument for him being in top 10 as well. Similar to Symbiote Supreme, first list I think where I am excluding him. I still think he has ton of value, and we have seen him being used in several of the more recent events and challenges. But at the same time, every time we end up using Symbiote Supreme, it was largely dictated by Kabam, because we had to use symbiote champions, for instance, in that Karina Abyss challenge, and he's virtually the only mystic symbiote, or similarly to against that Icarus, where we had to use a symbiote champion yet again, and obviously he just, again, is solo, unopposed, kind of when it comes to the symbiote mystic champion. So that is the thing that mainly gives him claim to power rather than his own abilities. And I think at this point, obviously, if there is a matchup that he works in, he still does amazing. But at the same time, he's also one of the weakest champions in matchups that aren't, you know, basically tailor-made for him. And, you know, if you pull Symbiote Supreme right now, would you be immediately urged to rank him up? I doubt it. You would rank him up if you needed him for something, but in general, he just doesn't have that same aura of dominance in the class, I would say. Okay, that being said, let's get to the actual top 10. I don't want to miss out any honorable mentions that could have been made. I think Mordo at the moment is quite interesting as well. I definitely want to see how his buff works out properly. And I'm actually looking at Guillotine slightly more and more, because I like the fact that if she's high Sig, there's virtually, you know, she bypasses the problem with the bleed immunity by going with Rapture, and there's virtually no one immune to both, I would say. Anyways, spot number 10, and this time around I'm going to put Ebony Maw. I do think Ebony Maw has been proving himself more and more across the contest. Obviously, Battlegrounds is yet another game mode that enabled this guy to shine defensively and offensively, and with that fact that more and more people are ranking him up, he's gaining more popularity. There are several things to like about him as a Mystic champion, obviously, because he does have fairly solid forms of power control in his heavy attack and in his level 3. His primary form of damage is a passive degeneration that, again, very few champions can do against. You know, it bypasses virtually all of the immunities. I think we have maybe 3 or 4 champions in the contest that can mitigate the degeneration damage, but nothing that is completely immune to it. And again, the fact that it's passive bypasses the shrug of things. And then he has also ability to passively reduce opponent's power gain, I think by up to 60%. Yeah, once you become focused, you know, all of the power gain buffs become a lot less intimidating. Now, the biggest kind of downside of Ebony Maw, I would say, is that his nullification abilities are fairly limited in the initial part of the fight. But once you do get Black Tongue, then, you know, his nullification abilities are fairly strong as well. It's just that he doesn't have it initially, where he can only nullify Fury, Cruelty, or Precision buffs, and obviously there are way more different buffs in the game available than just those 3. But the reason why I kind of edged up Ebony Maw is because of this thought process, where in MCOC it's always more beneficial to be amazing at 1 or 2 things than mediocre at many different things. Like we have Jubilee that has 50 different abilities, but none of them are kind of like potent enough for you to want to use Jubilee as your, original first kind of like champion to solve a problem. It's not to answer a question whether Jubilee can do that fight or scrape by somehow. It's to answer a question whether Jubilee is the champion if you want to deal with, I don't know, opponent's power gain, ability accuracy reduction, or something like that. And the answer is never. Jubilee is never a champion that's your go-to option. But with Ebony Maw, he does do many of these things well enough. But the thing that, again, he does have his own specific personal niche, which is the reason why I chose him above Sasquatch, above Dragon Man, above Symbiote Supreme, is because these guaranteed crits are sneaking in the contest more and more, and obviously up against champions that have guaranteed critical hits like Ghost, Hitmonkey, Corvus, and without a doubt we're going to get more of them in the future. And we do have more champions that have guaranteed special attack crits now, where again that is a non-issue for Ebony Maw. And the more content we have in a game that allows these specific niche scenarios to occur, the more these niche champions are actually increasing in the value, because they do get more and more places where to shine and use that fairly narrow ability. Now, if 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, that ability would be virtually meaningless, then today it's actually quite common when you do get to use it. It's virtually every other KVQ boss, or every other month we have somebody that has guaranteed crits there. As I said, there are, specific champions now that have access to guaranteed crits via special attacks or just on their basic attacks. And that all of that gives him and that specific ability more value, and that's why I kind of edged out Ebony Maw above the other champions that I look at relatively similarly in terms of their overall potential. Let's move on to spot number 9, and spot number 9 is going to go to Hood. Hood, I still think, is a perfect embodiment of a solid Mystic champion. Yet again, all the quintessential Mystic abilities are there. He has access to Stagger, he has access to Faith Seal, he has access to some power control, even though it's not the most potent one. But then obviously we do have the additional benefits of Hood being Hood. Number one being the invisibility, which gives you, opportunity to either save your skin when you mess up or find alternate openings, that's enabling you to, for instance, intercept on demand safely without worrying about getting hit in the face. There are downsides, obviously. The fact that Hood's invisibility, unlike most of the invisibility abilities, are a buff that can get nullified or hindered with, is not too great. So, it doesn't work as well, for instance, with Power Snack or Buffet nodes and stuff like that. But still, it is there, it is usable. And then one of the strong sides of Hood, again, kind of getting additional win in tiebreakers when it comes to should I rank up this champion or should I rank up that champion, is his importance in different synergy champions. And as we can see, he synergizes with several of the most dominant and important champions in the game. I don't have to explain exactly how amazing and great Ghost is across the board. And at the moment, arguably one of the most hottest, the one that's on the biggest win streak run, is Kingpin, because Kingpin is just going from strength to strength to strength. He's great in AQ, Alliance War, Battleground MVP, amazing for a crap ton of different challenges or different, story content that's coming out. And he's just extremely, extremely important champion to have. And the fact that Hood synergize with him, making him even better, yet again increases the likelihood you will want Hood on your team. And therefore, it's obviously always better to have a champion ranked up in those situations and scenarios. And the last thing is obviously the fact that he demonstrated, largely to me, thanks to Battlegrounds. And Mystic, as I have mentioned before, has this generic weakness where if a matchup is great, many Mystic champions are going to be OP. If opponents have a lot of buffs, you can nullify them freely and all that stuff is working. There's nothing impeding you from using special attacks. Mystics are going to shred. But if you're going up against champions that do not have any buffs inherently, there are problems with nullification or some punishments for it, so on and so forth, then Mystic Lass struggles. And specifically, I will reference Battlegrounds several times in this video, not because I think that, I should change up my opinion about all the champions because of Battlegrounds, but because Battlegrounds enabled me to see more in champions, to appreciate them more, because typically playing this game, the question that you ask is not whether this champion can do that fight, obviously which champion is the best doing that fight, which is your go-to option. Like, you have an entire roster that you can pick your champions from to beat that boss, for instance. In Battlegrounds, it was completely different. In Battlegrounds, you had to do the best you can do with whatever champions you drafted. And Hood was one of those versatility surprises there because of his Hex bullets. And he was one of the very few Mystic champions that could actually fight outside of that Mystic kind of box that we put these champions in typically. For instance, a good example is Maulman. You know, most of the Mystic champions wouldn't be particularly great against Maulman. They might do okay at best. But when you use Hood, you still had virtually perfect fight. You could still power drain him, gain more power for yourself, use your invisibility to fight alternate openings, thus not having to rely on the parries, which he would turn into monster mass. And then the fact that the Hex pistols and the damage Hex pistols do have nothing to do with buffs, and there's virtually nothing immune to it, and he shreds that fight. And that was the situation time and time again, where Hood was just surprisingly effective in scenarios you might not have thought of before. Because if you're going to see Maulman in, you know, a quest in Act 7, you're just going to bring Kingpin or Archangel, because those are the best options. But when those options were not available, it's very important which champions can step up to the plate and do those fights very well. And Hood definitely is one of those champions. So my respect for Hood is definitely, you know, grown as well due to that, due to Battlegrounds. There are a couple of problems. One of them is clearly incompetence and ineptitude of Kabam, because unfortunately there is still the bug where Hood only starts his timer to trigger invisibility on every second dashback. I can't believe they haven't fixed that. And they haven't fixed it to Seal Warrior, Crossbones, Hood, and I think somebody else. It's just such a huge annoying bug where some champions work perfectly fine, like Nightcrawler or Falcon, and they will always trigger that timer to, you know, activate the abilities. And then we have this whole set of champions that went through the buff program that just don't work 50% of the time when you dash back. So that is definitely frustrating. It can make a lot more fights kind of like more annoying. It's not the fault of the champion, it's just the fault of Kabam for not fixing a bug. And the last thing is obviously still the fact that the bullets are persistent charges, which I think there's absolutely no reason for them to be that way. I think you should just start every fight with 28 bullets, and Hood would be significantly better as a champion. Now, luckily, again, it doesn't come into play in every game mode, and you're normally fine. But at the same time, if you bring in Hood in a longer quest and you run out of bullets, then, you know, the champion is a shadow of his former self, and it is just frustrating because it feels unnecessary. Right, all that being said, amazing champion, love Hood. Spot number 8 is going to be Scarlet Witch Sigil. And Scarlet Witch Sigil has taken a bit of a dip, in my opinion. I still think she's amazing. I still think she's one of the most fun champions. I love the fact that she is yet again, similarly to Hood, a champion that does not necessarily rely on opponents having buffs, because she brings her own, and that, you know, enables her to perform well in many matchups. A typical Mystic champion might not do as well. She quite literally doesn't really care whether opponents have many buffs in their base kit or not. And then obviously the access to nullify and parries, I still think is very powerful ability. Access to several different types of damage or time effects, none of whom are, you know, essential for her damage output, but all of whom give her additional utility, ability to take different nodes, and, you know, gives her ability to stop opponents from evading, for instance, and reduce their regeneration rate, again, via poison. And then the fact that she can access 2 different types of degenerations. There's a lot in there and a lot to like. Power gain on heavy attacks is very potent too. Now, the problem almost largely lies in the fact that she does give opponents that unblockable buff as well. And that knowledge that opponents might go unblockable virtually at any point during the fight not only just makes the fights more dangerous, it also kind of screws with the player's head. And when push comes to shove, when it matters the most, when getting KO'd has the biggest consequences, like in Alliance Wars, for instance, you typically tend to shy away from even that type of possibility. Like, why would you put yourself in that risk when it matters the most if you could just pick a similar Mystic champion that does the fight, you know, approximately as well as she would, just safer. And that can't be helped with the current iteration of her. She is a controlled chaos. She can deal with that unblockable if you time it perfectly, but at the same time, on a personal level, for instance, I have noticed that I get hit in the face more with this Scarlet Witch than I do, for instance, with Hood or Claire or somebody else. And there are reasons for it. It's because of the unblockable buff, and it's also because of how it forces you to alter the way you play. It makes a lot of these fights a little bit more of a struggle than they should be. And, you know, a very basic example would be matchups where you need to reparry, or where you have chosen to basically reparry in order to prevent the opponent from throwing a special attack when you don't want them to throw that special attack. You hold that block up, fully expecting, you know, to block, and then reparry very quickly. Opponent dashes in at you, and they go unblockable. What you do then, right? You get hit in the face. And that alone is problem big enough, as it proves, for a lot of people to just not rely on this champion in many situations where she could be a perfectly viable option. Still amazing champion, still love using her, one of my Mystic favorites personally, but again, we do need to distinguish this personal favoritism from the champion rankings, and realistically, this is where I see her now at the moment. I still think there is an incredible amount of damage and potential and utility in that champion, but we also need to recognize the risks of using this champion. Moving on to spot number 7, and spot number 7 is still going to be Mojo. I know a lot of people like to ignore this guy. Offensively, everybody hates fighting against him. Obviously, defensive value is always going to be there for this guy. But I think offensively, a lot of people just look past this guy, thinking he doesn't have, you know, all that great of a damage, which he actually does. The thing that people need to remember, that Mojo is a ramp-up character, and one of the coolest iterations of ramp-up characters, because he's a ramp-up champion that you can ramp up in a single fight, but you can't necessarily carry it over fully to the next one. But it's fairly easy to get the max damage potential out of this guy, even in the first fight. It's just going to take you a bit of time to get there, but the more you use him, the quicker you get there, and the more devastating he is. And once fully ramped up, he breezes through the opponents. But the most important bits for ranking him up as high, obviously, number 1 is again that he has that passive degeneration that virtually only a handful of champions are immune to or can deal with. The fact that he, like Scarlet Witch, Sigil, is one of those Mystic champions that brings his own buffs to the fight, therefore he can cover more matchups and, you know, be amazing in those matchups than many other Mystic champions would be. He loses less, basically, when opponents don't have buffs. But perhaps the most important thing at the moment that I explained with Ebony Maw, where these niche abilities are becoming more and more, well, dominant, important in the game, is the fact that he doesn't actually nullify the buffs for most part. Now, the fact that he does have a nullify on his level 1 is definitely very helpful. But the fact that vast majority of his buff control comes from reducing the duration of them by 90%, thus forcing them to expire virtually within a second or two, also enables him to bypass a lot of counter Mystic nodes. And unfortunately, Kabam is in that mindset of putting up a counter for a counter for a counter, which we can, for instance, see with Penny Parker, Omega Sentinel, and many more champions like that, where, you know, she's gonna auto block, but wait, there are so many abilities that deal with auto block, therefore we're gonna make her immune to all of that, or something like that. And Kabam is doing the similar thing now with more champions, but nullify. Not only they are adding more and more nodes that deal a burst of damage to you if you nullify something, or just prevent you from nullifying stuff in the first place, makes opponents immune to specific nullifications. They're also releasing champions like Super Skrull or Captain America Sam Wilson, for instance, where if you nullify Sam's armor ups, he just re-triggers them as passives. If you nullify Hulkling's indestructible or something like that. He just, re-triggers it as a passive. And I expect fully more of this stuff to appear in the contest because, yeah, Kebab has quite clearly showed that their next line of thinking is to create counters for a counter of a counter or something like that. And Mojo has that unique niche. It isn't nullification, you just force them to expire. Therefore, any nodes that, give them nullify immunity, any champions that have some sort of abilities that would trigger when buffs are nullified, so on and so forth, they just don't work. So I do fully expect Mojo to be one of those champions that kind of squeezes past through on a technicality. And he does already do that plenty. So here we are. That's why Mojo is in 7th, in my opinion. And then obviously the regeneration and the rest of the stuff that guy has. Quite awesome too. Now, number 6 is going to be Vindication for some players, because for the longest time I haven't really been putting up Longshot either on these lists at all or putting him in fairly low positions, but I have definitely this time around increased his positioning in the Mystic class. And the reason for it is not because my opinion of Longshot has changed drastically. It hasn't. I still think exactly the same things about Longshot. I still think, that the burst amount of damage on him is great and that is his strongest suit. I also think that compared to other Mystic champions, his kit just isn't all that comprehensive and somewhat situational, where, again, opponents can't be Incinerate immune, they can't shrug off that specific debuff in order for you to do that damage. It doesn't have any immunities or virtually any power control, and typically, when a Mystic champion works, then you can find a Mystic champion that's going to work almost as well as Longshot's going to work in whatever scenario you need Longshot for, but it's going to be able to work more often and do different things. In essence, Longshot isn't that different, let's say, from Morningstar or, I don't know, Claire or Tiger or Sorcerer Supreme, where if opponents have buffs, you have Mystic Dispersion, you just supercharge your champion and you do hell of more damage than you would do in a generic situation. At the same time, Longshot has been proving himself to just land in more and more content very well and to be, the best option in specific scenarios. For instance, Longshot is the best Mystic champion for a lot of Battlegrounds matches because he is the fastest and because the amount of burst damage matters. On top of that, additional thing that Longshot slightly earned my respect for is his defensive capabilities in Battlegrounds. Man, I had some Longshot PTSD because he ruined so many fights for me. He really did. And he is a Battlegrounds powerhouse, I can't deny that. But again, as I said before, it's not only that I'm changing these rankings based on Battlegrounds. I actually try not to take Battlegrounds in consideration too much compared to the rest of the content. It's more so that it lets a lot of champions kind of like showcase their potential in situations where, they're less than ideal, for instance, or the impact they had in those matches. And Longshot is one of those guys that just peaks at the very tippy top when you need the most effective counter. And obviously with the Karina challenges and the fact that he was one of the better options for that as well, and he is gaining more popularity as the end result because people ended up ranking him for it, and now they naturally end up using Longshot for more and more different pieces of content, quite clearly shows that he is deserving to be in this spot, in my opinion. Right, let's move on to spot number 5. Spot number 5 is going to go to Sorcerer Supreme. Where is that Smurf? And Sorcerer Supreme is kind of like the mirror image, the antithesis of Scarlet Witch Sigil. Scarlet Witch Sigil is explosive, really fast, really dynamic champion, but also somewhat risky. Sorcerer Supreme is opposite of that. Even though in perfect matchups, obviously she can still put up very great numbers and close out the fights fast enough, but realistically she's one of the more slower top Mystic champions. She doesn't have the greatest amount of damage. The fact, however, is that she's almost always the safest option whenever you can use her. You can quite virtually just take everything in the block and be happy and smile and control the fight via very potent nullification aura, via having slow on your opponents, that's completely bypassing evades and unstoppables. Additionally, on top of it, as it turns out, armor break is not all that common for Mystic class, and it can be quite important to have it in specific situations. And while she isn't, a champion that, again, absolutely excels in one way or another, she's a champion that ties her abilities extremely well together and grounds them in actual content where people do want to use this champion because it is a very safe, secure, stable option. When it comes to the rest of her abilities, increased attack, again, as I said, she isn't the biggest damage dealing champion. Power control is far from being the most potent around, but just purely on that nullification and ability to hide behind her block virtually in all of the scenarios is increasing, her potential and usability by a ton, in my opinion. We see her frequently used in Alliance Wars specifically for that reason, that he is the safest option, which is kind of like the essence of Alliance Wars. Now, because of her damage, I don't think she's ever going to be a very popular Battlegrounds champion, but, who knows, maybe some nodes will let her do that. But again, not every champion has to be great for every game mode. And overall, when it comes for questing, when it comes for Alliance War, Alliance Quest, things like that, I do think she's a very valuable addition to people's rosters. Moving on, spot number 4 is going to go to Claire. I know some people are going to be upset. In my last rankings video, I put up Claire as 3rd. But once I kind of broke down exactly why we like Claire, it kind of became clear to me that at the moment, she lost that footing slightly to Diablo. Because for the longest time, the argument was always that the best Mystic champion was Dr. Doom if you're not running Liquid Courage Double Edge, and if you are, then it's Claire. And obviously, Claire does have a ton in her kit, and nobody can take that away from it. The fact that she has access to 3 different damage over time effects and 3 different immunities enable her to do a ton of different nodes in itself. Then the fact that she has, again, that niche ability that works as Nullify, but technically bypasses all the nullification punishment nodes, gives her additional value. Having all those nullification abilities on her base kits obviously work extremely well too. Ability to regenerate and everything else. She is a Swiss Army knife. Yet, as I mentioned several times in the past, I do think it's much more important to be the best and the go-to option for certain set of scenarios, rather than being a mediocre option or a decent option for more different fights. And when I was looking at Claire and Diablo, I realized that if I'm running Liquid Courage Double Edge, much more likely to use Diablo because he's quicker and because he's more potent, and because he does not have to sacrifice all of the utility that he has for specific effects. Anything that Diablo does feels more generic and more organic. Yes, you can make an argument, that Claire has power control, Diablo doesn't, that Claire has more immunities than Diablo, because Diablo only is pseudo-immune to poison, so on and so forth. But at the same time, everything that Claire does comes at a cost. If you want to regenerate, you're going to lose in damage and you have no power control. If you want power control, you can't regenerate and you're going to lose in damage. If you want this immunity, you have to ignore, those immunities. Claire's still a phenomenal champion. I still use her a ton, but I just realized that the argumentation for Claire that everybody used all the time of why she's as amazing she is, by those same sets of principles, I think Diablo does overtake her at the moment in contest. And to kind of further build on Diablo's kit, obviously, his damage output's crazy. His regeneration is crazy. His ability to mitigate up to 30% damage from all sources, again, is underrated. And then, obviously, additional bits of utility that you acquire from using your pre-fights, yes, makes your ramp up somewhat slower, but you can still regain that, which is something that you can't do in a fight with Claire. For instance, if you want to use one utility with Claire, there's nothing you can do to do the second thing simultaneously, for instance. With Diablo, you can use all of the pre-fights. Yeah, you're gonna, have a longer ramp up, but you're still gonna get there, and then all of those abilities are gonna work in the same fight. And yeah, at the moment, I think that, whenever I am running Liquid Courage Double Edge, then to me, and I feel for plenty of other people, Diablo now is the go-to option. And that kind of shows as well where we used to see Claire more in Alliance War. I personally have definitely noticed Diablo being used more in Alliance War. From Battleground's perspective, obviously Diablo was much more used offensive option than Claire was. Then Alliance Quest, again, I'm sure you can use both, but I'm also sure that Diablo is easier to use because, again, his regeneration abilities are just way more organic. And then the last thing is kind of damage and the reliance and impact of Liquid Courage Double Edge. With Diablo, well, first of all, Diablo does have way more damage potential than Claire does, which isn't the end of everything, but is just another feather in the hat of Diablo. But the second thing with Diablo is also the fact that... sorry, where are we headed? Dang it, lost my train of thought. So we went to damage, and then we were moving on to... Was it natural healing? Was it questing? Well, I do think I made the case either way. Oh, reliance of the Mystic Dispersion. I do think that Diablo functions better than Claire does without Liquid Courage Double Edge, which is often a scenario that we do have to play as well, because we can't always have the preferred mastery setup. And I do think that Claire relies on the damage increase from Liquid Courage Double Edge way more than Diablo does. In fact, of Diablo, I think that he's obviously at his best when you're running Liquid Courage Double Edge and Mystic Dispersion, but Diablo is perfectly capable if you're running virtually none of those things. If you don't have Mystic Dispersion, if you don't have Liquid Courage Double Edge, I think Diablo is still amazing Mystic Champion. Whereas I probably wouldn't necessarily want to run Claire without that. So that is my argument for putting up Diablo in third. In second spot's fairly simple. I think it's Tigra. And I think Tigra is doing as much of a carrying of Mystic class as Dr. Doom is, effectively, because Tigra is a different type of Mystic. Tigra is fairly atypical Mystic, kind of like the way Ghost is a typical tech champion. If tech class is known for armor buffs, heal blocking, power control, stuff like that, Ghost has none of that, you know? With Tigra, yes, she does have buff control, but it comes only in form of neutralize, really, in her base kit. And through that, you don't have any ability to deal with already existing buffs. Still, neutralize is extremely potent ability right now, and I think we currently see the very peak of what it can do, because again, it often bypasses a lot of different nullification, prevention, and immunities, and if these buffs never get triggered in the first place, it often lets you deal with many different nodes that otherwise would be tricky. The great example would be Unstoppable Armor, for instance, where you can nullify that armor up, but Unstoppable is on the way. But if the armor up never triggers, then, you know, there's no Unstoppable. But that being said, that's about all of the Mystic qualities that she has. She doesn't particularly care if opponents have buffs or if they don't. You know, it doesn't change that much in her damage output potential. And virtually everything else about her would be more similar to, I don't know, a science champion or a skill champion, where it's just, you know, she's, I think, for instance, quite similar to Black Widow Deadly Origins in a sense, where, you know, there is some damage over time effects, big amount of burst damage. But that combination of the existing buff control that she has with a very quirky playstyle just lets her run through the opponents, and she is de facto the best Mystic for your day-to-day needs. In fact, later on we're going to be talking about Dr. Doom. I'm going to be talking about how he is one of my least used rank 4 champions in my roster, and that's just quite because of it, and that's because of the problem that Mystic champions have typical. They're fairly weak coming out of the gate, especially weak in very, you know, vanilla scenarios when there aren't a lot of buffs. And Tigra isn't. Tigra is one of the fastest content clearers in the game. Tigra is one of the champions that's pretty much an autoban in Battlegrounds for a ton of people, and justifiably so, because she's an absolute machine of destruction. And I do think that the more time passes, the more people will get her, rank her, sig her, learn her. I myself I'm by no means a great Tigra player, but I spent quite a lot of time learning her, and I'm definitely much better with Tigra right now than I was 6 months ago. That being said, I don't think I'll ever be good enough where I bring her in Alliance Wars and stuff like that. But Tigra is well worth learning because the upside of it is just immense. In that way, again, you can draw a lot of similarities, for instance, with Ghost, where, you know, a lot of people were hesitant to learn Ghost, but they have no idea what they were missing out on. Tigra is pretty much that. And again, in vanilla scenarios, and kind of like pick up a champion for questing without thinking whether they're mystic skill or whatever, you know, Tigra will almost always be the first choice above Doom or virtually anything else in this class, because she's just a very quick, proficient killer that has, again, not much utility. There aren't 50 abilities. Most of that ability text is quite inconsequential to her. The things that matter is obviously the way she applies raptures. But when you look at Tigra, what does she do? She has neutralize, raptures, and you know, the phasing on heavy attacks. Everything else doesn't really matter there. But end result matters. It's kind of similar to Ghost. What does Ghost have? Phasing, guaranteed crits, and the weight counter. But when you use that to the best of the ability, the applications are virtually endless. Now, the downside of Tigra is obviously because virtually every matchup is different. You need to learn each individual encounters. Every champion you go up against, the fights will be different based on their abilities, and most importantly, animations. You need to be very adept at spacing, and you need to think on your feet. When can you start charging heavy attacks? When you should be spamming heavies, when you need to drop a regular combo and stuff like that. So there is a lot of learning. I would still say that Tigra is probably the hardest champion in the game to play, but it's very much so worth learning. And yeah, that's why she's here. But it's hard to dismiss the fact that when push comes to shove, and ultimately this is the most important thing, when you need to succeed the most, when you can't get KO'd, when you know that you need that W, that's where Dr. Doom comes. Dr. Doom is still by miles overall the best stat champion, which kind of clearly shows yet again that he was somebody's favorite champion, because he has some of the highest attack in the game, he has some of the highest armor in the game on the base kit, he has the highest crit resistance in the game. Then for shits and giggles, they gave him block penetration. And you know, most of the stats are just crazy good. The only one that, you know, they didn't get too carried away was the crit rate. If he had a high crit rate, you know, that would be even funnier. I think they stretch Doom about as much as you can champion these days without it feeling unfair, or without, you know, just it being way too much for the game. I think this is about the upper limit of how Kabam consciously can generously make an OP champion. There are like 4 champions maybe in the game like that, where you can clearly see that Kabam designed him to be insane. You know, when we got Ghost and Quake and even Tigra probably, I doubt that the designers foresaw how important and crazy these champions will be. With Dr. Doom is the opposite of that. I think Dr. Doom is kind of like, you know, the perfect machine designed by Kabam. Because he does everything that Mystic has to do. He has several different ways to nullify and buff control with staggers and nullification itself. He has very, very potent power control. And then obviously he has his own set rotation. And that is the display of dominance and the reason why we rely on Doom as much. Because once you put a champion in a Doom cycle, once you get that initial level 1 and level 3 off, there's very little opponents can do to mess you up. And that is a very big part of why he's so popular and dominant and safe and reliable. Because once you put opponent in Doom cycle, there's literally only 5-second or 8-second period where, you know, opponent might not want to play ball, but it doesn't even matter. The worst thing that's going to happen is that you might lose your Fury for a sec, you know, and you might need to throw level 3 again or something. But in general, it's just one of those situations where Doom is playing an opponent is watching. There's just nothing for them to do. And that's insanely powerful ability. Then obviously he has rest of the quirks with immunity to armor break, immunity to shock, access to incinerate, access to very powerful fury buffs, everything else. The man is still absolutely insane. And yeah, I doubt that there are many people who dispute that he's the best Mystic Champion in game. I know that there have been the arguments for Claire and Diablo, you know, because of the whatever masteries you are running. But let me put it this way. If Claire has her preferred mastery setup, if Diablo has his preferred mastery setup, and if Doom has his, Doom is still overall the champion that does the best, does the fights the safest, and probably does the most amount of them. The one downside of Doom that I have noticed, maybe one kink in his armor, is that he is fairly slow out of the gate in a typical Mystic Champion fashion. And again, it's kind of befitting to him as being the leader of the Mystic class. He is slow out of the gate. He's by no means, you know, a super high damage dealing champion that you want to go in and do a quest with if there are no nodes. No, you're going to use, you know, some Hercules, you're going to use some Tiger, you're going to use different champions. Because Doom is not that. Doom is not a champion that you bring in a quest to do every single fight. Doom is a champion you bring in when you have to bring him in, but at the same time you know that he's going to absolutely demolish it. Anyways, stretch. Man, this one again was 46 minutes. Jesus Christ. I get carried away. I apologize. I will just show the rankings again so you can see how they compare. So you can see that top 2 spots are the same. Claire and Diablo effectively swapped places. Sorcerer Supreme still is in 5th. Then we can see Scarlet Witch got down to 9th from 6th before. Longshot is a newcomer in spot number 6 instead. Mojo went up. Mojo and Hood basically swapped 1 place each. Again, you can interchange them, that's fine. And instead of Symbiote Supreme, we have Ebony Maw. And Symbiote Supreme and Dragonman are not on the list anymore. So that is it. And tomorrow we're going to get on with the next list. Sorry for taking your time so much. And hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'm going to catch you guys soon. See ya. Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about